Okay, so welcome everybody. We resume our works with a panel about Negri, une philosophie du commun, so a philosophy of the common. This session will be held in English, and we have four interventions. The first to speak will be Ece DURMUS. The title of her talk will be Reconsidering the Problem of Subjectivity Within the Common and Constituent Power. And Ece, like Sinem, who will speak after her, are two researchers from Turkey. And the second intervention by Sinem ÖZER will be entitled The Problem of the Negative in Toni Negri's Thought. Then we will hear from Sabrina de Crescenzo and Maximilian Tedesco, imagining the common Negri between Spinoza and Leopardi. And we will finish with A.Beria, Negri's Humanist reading of Spinoza, Critical Reconstruction. 15 minutes for each of you. We'll try to keep you on time. And then we will have approximately half an hour for the discussion with the public. So I'll let the floor to Ece DURMUS.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing for this event and for your effort, because it's difficult, I guess. So I would like to begin with the words written on a poster in recent protest in Turkey. We are on the edge of all possibilities. The edge of possibilities reveals a crisis, but it also holds many opportunities. Every threshold is a creative moment. As neoliberalism dismantles nation-states, and builds corporate states, sovereignty re-emerges in its most violent form, through the state's renewed right to kill. The principle of sovereignty is changing its own assemblage by rendering humans disposable, relying on the right to kill, and zombifying them, relying on the right to left alive. One of the most important features of capitalism's new era is the stratification of capital, rather than capitalization of the state. The public sphere has been fully absorbed by capital and essentially wiped out. What we used to understand by state based on the public good has vanished. Instead, the state runs like a profit-driven corporation. Even the legislative and judicial powers, especially in Turkey, once meet to check capital, have been captured by it. Capital wants to create an infinite smooth space for itself. However, resistance is the greatest eternal obstacle against capital. As we say yesterday, see today, and we'll see tomorrow, millions of people are taking to the streets and numerous movements, resistance actions blow up. All of them are expression of the truth of resistance. Negri in Marx and Foucault calls in the book of Marx and Foucault in English calls for, if we still want to talk about the logics of the left, we have to do so in terms of an altermodernity capable of radically reviving the antagonist spirit of the socialism of yesteryear. When I think on the political process we are living through in the light of this call, the question I ask myself is, all these struggles and resistance that have spilled into the street to defend life and to reclaim the common, seized by capital and the state through representation and domination, what is preventing them from becoming a constituent power? I believe that in order to problematize this crisis of resistance, we need to think about this concept of subject and subjectivity, the transformation of these concepts, and the political tendencies they reveal. We can consider this problem in terms of the three main forms of subjectivity: modern, postmodern, and altermodern. While the modern subject has long been criticized, it's just as important today to critically examine postmodern subjectivity as well. So, where does that leave us? What has postmodernism really produced, and where do we go from here? In the final part, I will turn to altermodern subjectivity deriving on Negri's work, My goal is to explore how subjectivity can be shaped through both singular and common, and how this opens the way for a new kind of constituent power through our times. The modern subject marks a shift. Sovereignty is no longer grounded in divine authority but in human reason. With secularization, the sovereignty derives its legitimacy no more from a transcendent but transcendental source, which brings with it powerful terror of the subject. In this new framework, the subject does not seek divine truth or good, instead it invents, defining its own truths, laws, and values. In modern philosophy, reason is understood as an active subject. It does not simply perceive or reflect the external world passively. Instead, it plays an active role in shaping meaning and making experience possible. In this sense, reason intervenes in the world by objectifying it. The modern subject replaced the one, God or idea, and now claims to represent truth based on its transcendental power of judgment. Yet this power does not have any ground in a singularity of subjectivity woven by affection of body. On the contrary, it is grounded logical and epistemological reason, which provides the basis of the universal judgment. The reason's claims is that it is the sole power that can turn the many into one, to universalize the particular. In this sense, universality is the form in and through which the common is represented and abstracted. The modern subject has captured the common in representation and universality. In postmodern thought, let's say, which emerged as a critic of modern subject. It is especially important to highlight in this presentation the influence of Nietzsche and Heidegger. Nietzsche considers reason with its modern subjectivity as a symptom of decline. Truth, for him, is always product of the will to power. It is constructed through struggles in life, not through abstract principles. Heidegger, in his conception of Dasein, redefines subjectivity as rooted in temporality and existence. Dasein does not construct transcendental through mental categories, but through its temporal experience of being. Heidegger continues the tradition of transcendental thinking, but transposes it on an ontological ground. The transcendental force of Dasein is bound up with time. We always exist within the interplay of past, present, and future. Time is not mental form, but an ontological reality, the very fabric of existence. Subjectivity is constructed now, it encounters by actions, in other words, through a performative relationality. But Heidegger's ontological way of thinking subjectivity risks drifting into materialist fatalism or mystification. What it challenges the universal modern subject, it avoids antagonism and collective political possibilities. As Negri argues, the absence of power concept, the mystification of time, and the solitary structure of Dasein limit its political potential. Subjectivity remains individualistic, and freedom appears as something assumed or given. Foucault creates a unique philosophical assemblage by bringing together, Heidegger's the idea of ontological immanence, one that trusts in the richness of open-ended spontaneous encounters, with Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, which energizes this immanent field. This assemblage becomes clear in Foucault's concept of power. Power is not a transcendental or oppressive structure, but decentralized, diffuse, and productive network of relations. For Foucault, subjectivity is produced through both the capture mechanisms of biopower and possibilities of biopolitical resistance. But here, the relationship between power and resistance is not antagonistic but agonistic. Power is not simply a system of domination, but a dynamic field of strife, contestation, negations. Resistance is performative, not a simple reaction to oppression, but a strategic practice constantly engaged with power. These strategies are local, temporary, contingent, and tactical. Yet, Foucault's approach, when it comes to the question of transformation of resistance into a constant practice of freedom, shifts its focus not toward the common, but toward an ethics of the concern of self as a practice of freedom. This ethical political orientation is valuable, yet it falls short of creating antagonism and developing the idea of the common. So, I have a time. Okay. Okay. Postmodern.
5-6 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Postmodern subjectivity is characterized by singularity, performance, and reactive critique. It is incapable of moving beyond a reactionary anti-stance. Liberation is reduced to individual ethical practices with agonistic relations, but a constitutive subjectivity must include not only difference and singularity, but also common and antagonism. A constitutive subjectivity must go beyond reactive local strategies. It must grant a collective practice of freedom rooted in multiplicity and antagonism. Insurgency, in his account on the Machiavellian inspiration for transformation in times crisis, Toni Negri posed pivotal questions for struggles for freedom. The constituent subject must once again be seen in action, but where, in which dimensions? Traditionally, the constituent subject has been either viewed in theories of sovereignty through the lens of voluntarism or as an absolute determinant, or has been criticized nihilistically for its technological domination over nature. Altered modernity, however, offers a space to reconceptualize the constituent subjectivity as a practice of freedom. Negri ties the concept of constituent power to emancipatory practices. He probes within the practice of freedom, how can we construct decision and common decision based on difference? Negri's theory of subjectivity emerges as the fundamental conditions for overcoming the prevailing crisis. What we call altered modern subjectivity goes beyond traditional unitary and identity-based notion of the subject. It opens space for a new mode of constituent subjectivity. For Negri, Foucault's text on subjectivity as constructed within productive and creative relations has a pivotal significance. What is even more important for Negri is that Foucault's approach does not allow to see subjectivity as simple produced and reproduced by systems of power and domination. Instead, it introduced the possibility of practices of freedom antagonist to these systems. Production of subjectivity is not only a matter of being governed, it is also about pushing forward, resisting, and expressing the will to be free. But there is also a tension here. Foucault considers resistance as something already embedded in power. Power and resistance are intervenant, which set limits in advance on our thinking on antagonism and genuine ruptures. Power in Foucault is not a mechanism of capture, but an expression of the freedom within relations that makes resistance possible. Besides, his ethics of the self celebrates singularity but does not quite account for the common, that allows singularities to emerge as difference. We are left with a question. How can we take resistance beyond its reactive form and turn into a collective constituent force of liberation? Such a rupture may be possible by transforming our understanding of freedom. Foucault stressed freedom as a precondition for power relations. So practice of liberation risks to be confined to an ontological emptiness. But what if freedom isn't a given? What if it is something we produce politically and collectively? Then freedom becomes more than opposition. It becomes creation. It becomes an act of political composition, not just resistance. In this context, freedom should be understood not merely as a negative reactivity, but as a creative and affirmative form of action that politically constitutes the freedom. In contrast, the concept of biopower and power, biopolitics and force, potentia, grounded in this new understanding of freedom, point to an antagonistic constituent power. Here, resistance is not mere opposition, it is a generative force that creates, produces, and sustains freedom. Recalling Spinoza, power is the capacity to act, a productivity directed toward affirming life, collectively. I mean relationality and activity. Constituted power isn't built upon an affirmation inherent in negation, but upon a negation inherent in affirmation. Resistance becomes reactive when it fails to produce such affirmation. Conatus as affirmation means a strategic practice aimed at identifying problems and deciding on their solutions. Only through affirmation can we begin to imagine a new subjectivity. It is produced through the common, not in reaction to domination, but in active creation that exists. For Spinoza, affirming constituent power as activity as strategic practice rather than reactivity requires what he calls the second kind of knowledge. Reactive understanding shaped by how the world affects us limits freedom. In contrast, the second kind of knowledge emerges in and through adequate ideas, which are not grounded in abstract reason, but in common nations produced from within the richness of encounters. Here, knowledge is a matter of detached cognition, but of collective lived experience because it depends on the composition of encounters. Reason becomes effective only when it's shared. When bodies come together, form compositions and increase their collective power and become active. In a collective and embodied realm where experience is not marginalized, reason functions not epistemologically but ethically and ontologically. Common notions then are not about objectifying the world. They are dynamic events produced through differentiation, transformation, and the shared effort to persist in freedom. Considering Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, such reason's transcendental power generates directly from experience and the common. Here, transcendental isn't the idea of a subject providing the conditions of possible experience. It expresses the real realm of experience, the real and concrete condition of experience itself. And for Negri, the common appears not only as a result, but also as a condition, a virtual condition transposed into the regime of real possibility. This virtual realm arises from the reality of power relations and contingency. It doesn't stem from logical necessities, but from productive and strategic contexts. Relations are not discovered, they are constituted, they are not given, they are produced through effort. Therefore, what determines the relations is production, strategically shaped in and through power relations. We must rethink the transcendental not as a Kantian domain of representation or universal reason, but as rooted in ethics, practice, expression, and meaning. This is the realm of the common. And an idea of transcendental force or power, based on the collectivity of the act of making, allows us to reclaim to the act of creation and decision as a concrete practice of liberation, which has been hitherto suppressed and rendered inert. When thinking about leftist subjectivity today, a key question arises: how do we organize freedom in the face of subjectivities produced by fascist and far-right forces? The right constructs a form of solidarity under the guise of brotherhood built on complicity, while the left struggles with trouble of fragmentation, individuations, and alienations. Common political spaces, factories, assemblies, municipalities, in Turkey particularly even the ballot box, are under the mafia-like siege by capital and authoritarian power. The street has become the last arena for the visible political existence. In this context, producing an antagonistic subjectivity becomes essential if we are to break this siege and move toward constituent power in the spirit of the Negri's ultramodern thought. So that's it.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think we can immediately
no title here.
Start. Yeah, absolutely.
I couldn't help you. Sorry. Okay, thank you to all who made it possible for us to come together here. Thanks again. I will also start from something that has been already mentioned in several interventions so far. But in this historical moment we live through, where the negative forces of capital and the state tend to form together new fascistic configurations, we see that the efforts to pit the power of the negative critical thought against that of the affirmative constituent thought gather a new momentum. We feel it, I think, in every intervention so far. But these efforts should not be seen as an exercise in thought, I think, because they have very real effects for every one of us here, I think. In the end, it's a question of facing the novelty of our current situation. And I believe Toni Negri indicates to us a possible way of approaching it when he says, I will quote from him now, I believe that once all dialectical mediation is set aside, once Heidegger's hypostasis of being has been criticized, the problem of the negative reappears. How can confront it inside, within, in the heart of materialist ontology? How can it be assumed, resolved? How can one suffer it and destroy it in a world without an outside? End of the quote. These questions, which he says have always preoccupied him in his dialogue with Deleuze's materialist ontology, I think first of all refer to two different ways of dealing with the problem of the negative. One, as we all know, the dialectical contradiction, and the one maybe we are less familiar with, the Heideggerian nothing. It is no coincidence that the genealogy of Negri's concept of antagonism offers antidotes to nihilism inherent to these allegedly alternative conceptions of the negative. In fact, in both cases, his conception of antagonism serves to reveal to what extent the problem of the negative is a poorly or falsely posed problem in relation to the nexus between power and resistance. Since the Hegelian negative, the so-called root of all movement and vitality, is always a determinate negation which conserves or recuperates that which it negates, for Negri, the Hegelian dialect is always already reactionary. The dialectic condemns or resistance to become the negative other of power, thus they are always prefigured and hence they can always be reconciled. The contradiction is always the driving force of synthesis, reconciliation, or resurrection, let's say. Devoid of any power of subversion or separation, contradiction is a falsified figure of antagonism. The negation of negation is always a false movement, and struggles never proceed by way of the negative. This is Negri's own words. Negri would admit that the left Heideggerianism, in Italian thought, maybe, is somehow a correction to the false problem, to the false Hegelian problem of the negative, to the extent that it defies any attempt to predetermine, mediate, or synthesize being. In fact, like in Hegel, the negative in the form of that is still the ground, but unlike in Hegel, it is now freed from any subject and teleology. In the end, that is the indeterminate, unrepresentable, but absolute negative in Heidegger. That has the possibility of impossibility is the indeterminacy inherent to being, which does not let it close upon itself and constantly exposes it to alterity. Yet this Heideggerian negativity is still a poorly or weakly posed problem because it is devoid of any thought of power and thus any vision of destruction and overcoming of the limits. It only abandons us to a constant fear of being captured by a unity, a contempt even for any determination, and consequently a flight from struggle and constitution. In contrast to a thought of negativity, which curtails or relativizes the power of either the negative, as in Hegel, or the positive, as in Heidegger, Negri keeps reminding us that antagonism always produces a surplus of power. It is creative. However paradoxical it may seem, antagonism is not a figure or form of negativity. On the contrary, it is the unthought of both the dialectical and the negative thought, because they are both incapable of grasping antagonism as the irreducible creative element within and beyond negativity. So, having settled accounts with the problem of the negative and its nihilistic implications long ago, it is now quite interesting that Negri urges us to confront it on the terrain of materialist ontology, Deleuze's ontology, which is for sure affirmative and creative. Is antagonism also the untold of this materialist ontology? Can it be like that? Are we faced with another poorly posed problem? More importantly, is it possible that the affirmative thinking itself become another source of nihilism in our struggles, especially? Negri's question the question he poses against Deleuze, this question, I think, hints at this possibility. And it urges us to explore this paradox, this possibility of a nihilistic element in an affirmative thinking, something that perhaps prevents us from going to the limit of what we can do, something that may be living or struggles without weapons in the face of the negative forces of capital and the state. In fact, we all know, in fact, the status of the negative in the affirmative thinking is a matter of constant dispute for Deleuze himself too. It is enough to recall the first pages of Difference and Repetition, where the worst, he says, would be to fall back into representations of beautiful soul. There are only reconcilable differences. We are different, but not opposed. Not opposed. This is the image of beautiful soul according in relation to the differences. Although Negri's question about the problem of the negative is directed towards Deleuze, it is ironically Deleuze himself who provides a point of departure in search of a possible answer to this question. In this respect, his letter to Foucault in 1977, published much later under the title of Desire and Pleasure, this letter is even more illustrative and thought-provoking, where he argues against Foucault, Deleuze argues against Foucault that we still need a certain concept of repression and autonomous logic of resistance. This is a criticism from Deleuze directed towards Foucault. As Deleuze's letter suggests, Foucault's thought is a laboratory for testing the ability of the affirmative thought to assume and resolve the negative, which is clearly what Negri expects from it. Foucault, as we all know, objects to the concept of repression mostly because it implies an external power that relies solely on the power of the negative, a power that says no, that is unable to produce anything, that can at best set limits, let's say. When power is perceived only as the power of the negative, resistance to will only be imagined as a no to this power, originating from a field of freedom that is external or prior to power. This is the part destruens. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, but this is the part destruens, the critical part of Foucault's thought. It's okay.
Absolutely. Okay. Nobody's waiting.
Thank you for encouragement. Which destroys the dialectic. This is the critical part of his thought, which destroys the dialectic, and with it, contradiction as the grounding nexus between power and resistance. For Foucault, power is everywhere, and there is no single locus of refusal because reality is always a complex of strategic relations. Everything is constituted through practices. This Foucauldian realism of power is quite in agreement with Heideggerian notion of negativity, which defies all attempts to predetermine and synthesize. However, Foucault does not stop here and proceeds with laying a positive common foundation for power and resistance at the same time. And this is the par constraints, the positive part of Foucault's thought. How is it possible that power is both constitutive and coextensive with resistance at the same time? I think this aporia in Foucault's thought points us to another case of Heideggerian inspiration in Foucault, which seems to me to be left unconsidered in Negri's critique of the left Heideggerians or the weak thought. Remember that power for Foucault is a set of actions upon others' actions, and it is exercised only over free objects and only insofar as they are free. Therefore, in Foucault, there is no face-to-face confrontation of power and freedom. On the contrary, freedom is the precondition and even the permanent support for the exercise of power. As an ungrounded ground, very much like in Heidegger, it is the radical openness of the field of possibilities for diverse actions and reactions. The similarity between Foucault's and Heidegger's conception of freedom is really striking. Remember that for Heidegger too, freedom is the abyss of ground in Dasein. It is freedom which places Dasein in possibilities that gape open before its finite choice. This explains how Dasein's relation to death, which confronts it with the abyss of freedom, is in fact an agonistic relation. That is not an absolute negation in Heidegger, as it is never an event that is lived, experienced directly, let's say. On the contrary, that opens up a horizon of possibility. As being toward this radical openness, Dasein is incited and seduced by that to seize the possibilities for an authentic life. The similarity between Dasein's relation to that and in Foucault, power's relation to freedom is even more striking, as when Foucault says, and I'm quoting from him now, the relationship between power and freedom's refusal to submit cannot be separated. Rather than speaking of essential freedom, it would be better to speak of an agonism, of a relationship which is at the same time reciprocal incitation and struggle, and less of a face-to-face confrontation which paralyzes both sides than a permanent provocation. In Foucault, as we see, on the one hand, power and resistance co-belong to freedom, to the open field of possible actions. Therefore, they are both constitutive and constituted. On the other hand, it is freedom which holds power and resistance together in their separation. Therefore, they are coextensive. Power and resistance are always in struggle, and it is precisely in this struggle that they keep inciting each other. But the fact is that. And it is true that contradiction is not anymore the essence of struggle. Opposition is freed from binaries. Power and resistance are never resolved in synthesis. Yeah, these are all granted. However, they are always already univocal to the extent that theirs, I mean the relationship between power, their struggle, the struggle of power and the struggle of freedom or resistance, theirs is a relationship of agonism, of a permanent provocation. In freedom, they are a permanent and ineradicable limit for each other. Consequently, we have always the same struggle, whether it is fought by power against resistance or resistance against power. Nothing changes. They are univocal. Even if resistance is not reactionary, it is devoid of power of making difference. The demand for an alternative to power relationships becomes almost a demand for absolute impossibility. In Foucault, it is indeed true that we are never trapped in power, that's true, but perhaps, and what's worse, we are entrapped in freedom. Freedom is the nexus between power and resistance, which does not allow them to get into a face-to-face confrontation. It is that which prevents us from going to the limit of what we can do. In the end, we are always in struggle, but not opposed. Agonism, a nihilistic indifference, a lack of power of self-affirmation and self-valorization is like a heavy price we have to pay for escaping from being enclosed in power. Negri's concept of antagonism can also be taken as an antidote to this very puzzling agonistic form of nihilism, that is, a never-ending agonal or aporetic struggle, still focused on the limits rather than our power to overcome them. Negri points to the affirmative thought, another way of dealing with negativity, which is in fact only one, which is the limit as seen from the point of view of a force that wants to affirm itself, to overcome that limit, that wants to leave it behind. That is truly something which comes from the outside, and the limits are always external from the standpoint of antagonism. Therefore, for Negri, the struggle is never univocal, as it was in Foucault, and there is no homology between the two forces in struggle. It is obvious that there is a lien, a nexus between these two distinct elements, but they are only and immediately linked by the struggle itself. The lien is only the struggle, not freedom as the condition of possibility of struggle. One of the multiple senses of resistance comes first and power second is that there is no lien without antagonism, or better, no lien that is not shaped by antagonism. Just remember how Negri always insists that capital, however reformist it may be, never willingly passes to a subsequent or superior phase of the mode of production. In effect, capitalist innovation is always a constraint which drives from workers' antagonism. Indeed, in Negri, almost like in Hegel or unlike in Foucault, the negative has a power to produce. But unlike in Hegel, it does not produce a synthesis, but always a divergence, a surplus, a subjectivation. In the end, in Negri's own words now, all determination is not negation, but resistance, and it is resistance that constructs being. It's the power, puissance, that produces the world, yet it produces the world not as conditioned by a limit, but on the contrary, thanks to its ability to expand beyond that limit itself. Without antagonism, in short, there is no constitution and no creation. Okay, just 2 minutes.
Yeah, 1, 2,
Okay, thank you. We have started with a problem. Let's conclude with another but intimately related one. Having revealed a possible agonistic kernel in the Foucauldian analytics of power, can we still hold on to the opposition, if not the distinction between sovereign power and biopolitics? In the end, Foucault's definition of government as structuring of the possible field of action of others is the extension of his constitutive, thus agonistic conception of power relationships. Does not this conception of biopolitics risk leaving us without weapons in the face of negative sovereign forces of capital and the state? Does it really allow us to attack the nihilistic foundations of power in the sense of potestas? Or inversely, in order to confront with the negativity of our actuality, do we have to return to several theoretical variants of the state of exception, which usually share a common blindness to the forces of productive being, the antagonistic ground of constitutive power, and thus end up with celebrating the omnipotence of the state? Even if our world is no more dialectical and there is no more outside, no more room for mediation, we do not have to limit ourselves to an either-or alternative between an agonal or sovereign conception of power. Perhaps there is another possibility that we should consider. Perhaps the negativity of the sovereignty returns today not to the detriment of, but thanks to the intensification of biopolitical control. Perhaps everything depends on discovering again that it is the power, the antagonism of our struggles that makes power take that paradoxical form. Perhaps we are faced with a paradoxical form of power which becomes more repressive and hierarchical and even external insofar as to the extent that it becomes more machinic and subjectifying, let's say. In fact, when Negri makes a distinction between biopolitics and biopower and insists that it is only through opposition to biopower that the biopolitical lives, he hints us both at this fact, I think, and the way out from the real impasses of this world without outside. It is true that there is no place to be protected from the negativity or command of the capital and the state, that's true. Yet, thanks to the productive tension inherent to our being, thanks to those machines of subjectivity that we are, we can always be both realist and revolutionary, let's say. And I'm finished. I finished.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sinem and Sabrina and Maximilian. You can start right away.
So thank you, Andrea, for presentation and all equipe for inviting us. It's a very important. I'm very happy to stay here. I think so. This space, this new space, is very important to create a dialogue with between different generations. So thank you. And our speech try to explain the relevance of Spinoza ontology and Leopardi ontology in Negri's thought, but especially in Negri's political work. It's very important for us. So I start now with a part with Leopardi's part, and then I leave the floor to my partners. Well, in his philosophy, Negri makes extensive use of materialist devices that allow him to employ the concept of certain authors against the philosophical tradition of mediation, of the hierarchy of forms and of reason. In reference to this polemical dimension, he has always preferred to speak of potentia rather than potestas. And in doing so, two names are particularly important to remember, Leopardi and Spinoza. Especially concerning Spinoza, we know how much this research influenced his militancy, ultimately leading to a renewal of Marxism that was as much appreciated as it was criticized. Today, therefore, we will try to explain which concepts from Spinoza and Leopardi were fundamental to the development of his treatment of the common. The critical force of the European Leopardi is expressed in the relationship he maintains with the Enlightenment philosophy. The tradition of Renaissance humanism, in fact, meets and clashes in Leopardi with the materialism of the Enlightenment, opening up an antagonist divide between the two dimensions, which Negri names the dimension of life and that of knowledge. It's here that confrontation with Hegel arises, upon which Negri constructs much of his reading of Leopardi. The opposition in Leopardi between life and knowledge does not give rise to any dialectical rupture, especially not a temporal one, as in Hegel. The profound meaning of Leopardi's materialism lies precisely in this. Its confrontation with the dialectic that seeks to resolve the fissures and tears of reality, imposing its closure upon every process of critique and construction of time. Instead, this materialism is that of Leopardi's poetry. Reason tends to dissect nature, turning it into a grammatical matter, and nature cannot be recomposed or transformed by the second nature of poetry. It remains a dead body. To speak of Leopardi's relevance today, we must understand clearly what the second nature means in La Ginesta. It's artificial. If everything man has produced and which now covers existence, invests it, becomes its garment. This second nature defines the human capacity to become other than oneself and to generate life in the world. This life is that of words, of institution, and of customs. It's a form that creates a new metamorphosis of doing and speaking, a process that destroys every possible fixity at every step. And this war of illusions takes the shape of a double political actuality. On one hand, Leopardi describes in his poetry and prose the capitalistic artifice of this form of life, with the various structure of its dominion, the substantiation of society under capital, its tragic face, and the recognition of the difficulties that obstruct the necessary struggles to transcend it. On the other hand, Leopardi already developed an immense critique of this second nature and its many alienation. He proposes a new path, poetic, philosophical, and political, within the most concrete forms of life in artificial world. Now there is ethics, which constitutes a new ontology against all artificial metaphysics and against the violence of capitalistic domination. In this sense, Leopardi's poetry becomes a weapon, a critical event, and a potential antagonist force in response to the situation he faces in his present. Leopardi's materialism can then become life, because matter now lives within poetic, philosophical, and political imagination. Being in its infinity branching possibilities permits the form of the world, and these acquire their meaning through the active life of the subject who inhabit it, with their desire and their now and their new, and through illusions of freedom and love. Beyond the concrete acknowledgement of the catastrophe of memory, found in the events of the Restoration and the reactionary bloc on any revolutionary transformation following the impulse of the French Revolution of 1809. Leopardi doesn't give up at his core on tracing and reviewing the threats of a new historical rupture. The flattening of memory and the restoration
doesn't not extinguish the urgency of passions. The defeat of the oppressed is temporary and resolvable in a new true beginning. In this sense, poetry determines and produces time, that ontological time which inserts itself in the transformative process of being. Leopardi's problem of time also includes an extensive ethical and political reflection. Since poetry becomes a force of resistance against the poisonous waste of the present. Great importance along this line is given to Negri's encounter with the idol, l'infinito, the infinite, whose central theme is the relationship between finite time, which builds praxis, and metaphysical infinite time, which subsumes it. Ethics for Leopardi is the solution, not definitive. Ethics not as a hierarchy of being, but as a constitution, creation, and cognitive journey, where the finite is the foundation and the infinity the opening. Here unfold the ethical and civic content that Leopardi never abandoned. Abandoned. In this sense, Leopardi's poetry expresses the event-like character of the finite. And for this reason, to better express its anti-dialectical role, Leopardi is defined as subversive and revolutionary rather than progressive. In contrast to the progressive interpretation of Luporini, with whom Negri shares many points, Negri speaks of an ethical political Leopardi who constantly constructed new threads of meaning based on the unwavering premise that life is an active force. And yet, there is not ultimate joy for Leopardi. The constitutive tension of being is neither overcome nor resolved. Ultimately, second nature means building life beyond the mere natural existence. And if this process constitutes human civilization, it's also necessary induce unhappiness, habituation, and the blockage of potentialities and openings of meaning. Here opens the irreconcilable conflict between pain and desire. Leopardi and Spinoza, as noted, don't speak of the absolute, nor do they offer categorically valid solution. It's practice, the constant tracing and describe of our potentia, that matters not abstraction, but rather modify and constructed reality. Love and freedom perfectly express the collective, passionate action of building together, a path common to both Spinoza and Leopardi, which Negri naturally adopts as a key to his philosophical and political journey. Poetry, as mentioned, unfolds as a transformative praxis of being, a true ethical praxis of freedom. Spinozistically understood, that always resolve the infinite and the absolute in the construction of finite lives, conscious of their doing and being. In Leopardi, like Spinoza, finite lives experience the joy of meaning with eyes always gazing on the edge of nothingness. Still, they always and not less rediscover the desire and love on ethical being, that it was always affirmation. Poetry then is refusal. Its descent against the world tragedy and the beginning of the human creation. It's a shared fabric of meaning, of innovation and otherness, poesis and praxis, to a labor, mind and body in and out of time.
That'll be a to rethink revolutionary subjectivity, Spinoza plays a fundamental role, because from him Negri draws the concept of democracy as omnium absolutum imperium, democracy as ontologically absolute. In Spinoza's framing of the problem, the issue becomes affective. Democracy is a form of sociality, implicated and present even in non-democratic forms of government. There is, in other words, no imperium in imperio, because there is no absolute will, but every constitution of any kind of power, of any kind of government, implies somehow an effective disposition of the multitudo. The problem of democracy thus becomes simultaneously a passionate and a cognitive one. Within the constituent tension of the multitudo is a matter of adequately understanding what can be produced as a political body, that is, to grasp the socialization as a process of becoming active. Knowledge is given in Negri and in his reading of Spinoza through doing, and when applied to the communist question, it raises the issue of the liberation of productive forces. The multitudo can imagine and produce another plane of ethical and political constitution only from an adequate understanding of its own casual and productive potentia. Spinoza offers an ontology in which substance is infinitely productive. This means that since every model reality is an expression of substance, that the infinite is the structural organization of the ethical. The constituent dimension of community is thus an increase in both individual and collective power as potentia, since only ex communi decreto does it become possible to confront death and the obstacles that our potentia faces. The infinite does not redeem the finite, because Spinoza teaches that there is no original sin, nor any ontological defect, and no need for a linear plot moving the world through the objectification like the Hegelian spirit. On the contrary, the finite, it is contingent and human-like character, has its own dignity as a productive force. The infinite is immanent to all locations of finitude, which are therefore full and positive expression of production and of the ethical as a form of an activity. Similarly, the framework of freedom can no longer be conceived eschatologically. There is no endpoint that closes the constituent process, only freedom as a constant praxis. The unfolding of desire is therefore antithetical to death. Spinoza's idea of becoming eternal refers to a dimension where the mind and body become so active that death barely registers in thought. The wise person is, I quote Spinoza, the one who reflects mostly on life. In the community, this means that the cognitive socialization, the awareness of the constant metamorphic process of individuals into community. Adequate knowledge then does not hypostatize any particular temporality, but instead posits the community as eternal, precisely because imagination here does not crush the political body under the auxilia imaginationis, but orients it toward a constant ethical activity of production. Consequently, eternity is no longer merely the epistemological guarantee of the concept, but rather, I quote Negri, it's implicit in the field of praxis. In the collective mimetic dynamic, affects themselves appear as relationships that precede individuality and that constitute it, crossing and connecting it, as promoters of mutualism and regulators of violent situations. The risk of projecting one's affective traces onto the others is that of reducing plurality to an abstract and totalizing unity. Even metaphysics, though often presented as an eminent ideal form in which thought is reduced to an organized totality, is not really, in Negri's view, an unified whole. The alternatives produced by class struggle and class conflict testify another history of metaphysics, the cursed history of the materialist tradition that reveals how power relations cause juridical and transcendent abstraction of the norm. From the Spinoza's concept of jus sive potentia, Negri develops his constituent and resistant alternative, a politics that centers productive forces in an horizontal way, without mediation, where law is power and cannot be handed over to a sovereign. Multitudo therefore does not need any representative. It represents and expresses the multiplicity and plurality it produces and it is produced by. The experience of the multitudo, combining cupiditas and potentia, expresses the tension-filled process of each mode constituting itself as a common connective tissue. Therefore, the movement of the multitudo does not suppress differences. On the contrary, does not suppress differences. On the contrary, they are exalted in contact with the other. No one can be reduced to the other, for that would negate the movement itself. The question of temporality, as with Leopardi, is crucial here. Negri cannot place the power of the multitudo within the classical horizon of the philosophy of history, which he has openly criticized, within the time of power which exists but is amply deluding and dissolving everything. The horizon of potentia is organized by the infinite itself. Time of power is about maintaining form within a determined time, an inertia of forms and a dissolution of lives, deluded and consumed. Whereas the time of the multitudo is a fusion of duration and eternity, a full time, the time of a politics conceived and enacted through a collective praxis of immanent resistance, in which law, in Negri's reading of Spinoza, plays a central role. In conclusion, in light of the relationship with Spinoza and Leopardi, certain categories in Negri's political reflection become clearer. For example, the concept of multitudo is broad and complex. On the level of critical theory of political economy, the power of the multitudo is the Marxian living labor, also subjugated to capitalist exploitation. Whereas on the ontological political level, it does not coincide solely with the working class, but is presented as a counter-empire, the totality of the exploited and oppressed, who, through their labor, autonomously produce and reproduce the entire world of life, through being expropriated from it by imperial power. The production of the multitudo is therefore bipolitical. The classical Marxist dichotomies between productive and unproductive labor, production and reproduction, are now surpassed. The category of proletariat has changed and expanded because capitalism has settled into the most intimate corners of our lives. The confrontation must happen at the European and global level. Negri already insisted on that in the La Lenta Ginestra. Because to still speak of nationalism today, to still speak in this old kind of dynamics between nations, between state, is some sort of barbarism in its worst, or idle chatter at its best. The multitudo is considered precisely as a program for political organization, as the hinge between the plural social ontology and the possibility of a real democracy. And the common is the condition of possibility for this kind of incarnation of the multitudo. The common, therefore, as a space of cooperation and liberation from labor, as a means to build non-sovereign institutions, as a non-property that is a fundamentally different means of organizing the use and management of wealth. Put more colloquially, the common is what we share, or rather, is a social structure and a social technology of sharing. Negri, through his full and constant militant life, has widely demonstrated that there is an alternative to the deadly temporality of capital, and that it must be built together by staggering in and for a heterogeneity of voices. Thank you.
And we can conclude with A.Beria.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this. I'm very happy to be here. I'll go right into it. So my title is Negri's Humanist Reading of Spinoza, Critical Reconstruction. From the mid-20th century to today, on the one hand, in opposition to the more orthodox Hegelian Marxist tradition, and on the other hand, in opposition to its official Soviet version, what has been called Tiamat, Spinoza has been an inspiration for many of the radical Marxist thinkers, first of all for going against teleological and anthropocentric or humanist readings of Marx, and proposing a different kind of ontology, as well as a different kind of account of liberation and freedom. On the one hand, Negri's radical interpretation of Spinoza is an important contribution to this project, but at the same time, we see that, and it has been argued, that Negri, in his radical Marxist reading, interprets Spinoza's philosophy arguably in terms of a humanist, proto-teleological tendentiality towards freedom. How can we account for this disparity in the readings of Spinoza in the Western Marxist tradition, vaguely from the 1960s? What is it about Spinoza that gives the opportunity to have such diverse interpretations? I will argue that this disparity has to do with the understanding both of the concept of the attributes as well as the concept of the infinite intellect in Spinoza. I will propose that it is the equation of the infinite intellect with the human consciousness or mind that leads Negri to maintain, or some kind of interrelation between them that leads Negri to maintain a humanist reading of Spinoza. To do this, I will critically reconstruct Negri's reading of intellect and attributes in the savage anomaly, and I will concentrate on the savage anomaly only. At the same time, I will give an alternative reading of attributes and the infinite intellect based on other readings of Spinoza, especially Deleuze, but also Yuval Urbani and Chantal Jacquet. In doing so, I will try to show that by interpreting the concept of the attributes and of the infinite intellect in Spinoza differently from Negri, we can maintain Negri's radical reading in its centering around the concept of the subject, potentia, and unremovability of the possibility of freedom, while at the same time avoiding commitment to humanist teleological tendentiality. So I'll go into savage anomaly, and I apologize for this first part because it's a bit too much of Spinoza, but I cannot go otherwise. So as Negri maintains, and as I also take as my starting point, Spinoza's philosophy bases politics in metaphysics and vice versa, metaphysics in politics, by precisely equating both political action and activity at the level of individuals, and on the other hand, being as action and or activity at the level of indivisible substantial totality or infinity or total infinity, by equating both of them to the constitutive power or power of self-constitution. This power then in Spinoza is understood both as the substantial indivisible totality, as the infinite essence of being or nature, and at the same time as being nowhere else than in the existence of finite individual modes. So as modal at the same time. It is this essential power or constitutive potentia that Spinoza also calls life in his treatise on Descartes, or the power of existence, and that is what is the common essence to both finite individuals and infinite being or nature in its good infinity. So not just the sum of the quantities of the finite, but qualitatively infinite nature, to which there is no outside and no externality. But of course, the point of no externality and the indivisibility also, just as the point of the indivisibility, cannot be maintained for the finite modes that always exist in external interrelations to each other. How can we think then of God or nature as holding together both of these moments, finitude with externality and infinity in indivisibility? This distinction between these two perspectives in Spinoza are expressed with defining nature or God and its essential power as both natura naturans and as natura naturans as the infinite indivisible totality in its essential unity or oneness, and also as natura naturata, the same infinite totality in its plurality and transversality, in its modal finite differences. So nature is both one and many, both natura naturans and natura naturata. But how can this be? Traditionally, attributes, the concept of attributes of God, have been understood as having precisely this function or this agency, the emanative function of being the agents of top-down attribution or degradation or degrading organization from one infinite indivisible total God, natura naturans, to the reality of being as interrelational multiplicity of finite individuals or natura naturatam. But this understanding of attributes is precisely what is rejected by Spinoza in his definition of the total essence as the total existence, life to which there is no outside, and which is therefore transparent, present, and there is nowhere else where some parts of nature's or God's power are. Everything is always here and present. So there is no degradation from the one level to the other, as there is only one level where all the power is. And even though Negri himself proposes this interpretation at the end of Savage Anomaly, this is an interpretation of the Spinoza's philosophy in general, for him this means that the notion of the attributes that in the beginning for Spinoza, according to Negri, were precisely those external emanative agents of top-down distribution still, have gradually fallen out from Spinoza's philosophy by the end, together with the distinction between natura naturans and natura naturata. And this is so even if, as Negri himself notes, Spinoza defends attributes to the end in his correspondences. In this talk then, instead of arguing for this falling out of the attributes, I am proposing that attributes have never had this emanative role in Spinoza and are thus still there in the above radical definitions of power, substance, and individual finite modes. In doing so, I will maintain that Negri argues against this precisely because of his humanist reading of both attributes and intellect. So what are attributes for Spinoza? And I can, sorry for the a bit esoteric, maybe, I don't know. So in the Ethics, Spinoza defines attributes in this way, and I quote, "By attribute, I understand what the intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence." So attribute for Spinoza is that by which intellect knows or grasps the essence of substance or its power. In other words, attributes do not exist in substantial way as substance or modes do, but they exist for the intellect. But right away, we need to say that this does not mean that they can be understood as purely subjective or as existing for the human subject, because this has to do with the definition of intellect. What is intellect in Spinoza? So in Spinoza's definition, it is intellect itself and not the attributes that is a mode of substance or mode of power, which means mode means self-constitutive power itself, that exists then substantially, but as an infinite, not a finite mode. It is the infinite essential power that exists in the whole of nature as natura naturata, or as in its multiplicity. Spinoza comments on the relationship of the definition of intellect to attributes in his correspondence, and I quote, "The intellect, though infinite, pertains to natura naturata, not to natura naturans. However, I still do not see what this has to do with the understanding of attributes, by substance, I understand, by substance, which means God or nature, I understand what is in itself and is conceived through itself. I understand the same by attribute, except that it is called attribute in relation to the intellect. End of quote. So infinite intellect is an infinite self-constituting mode, self-constituting power, which is always already and infinitely there in the whole of nature as natura naturata in its modal multiplicity. It is there, it could be argued, either implicitly or explicitly, because otherwise natura naturata would not be distinguished from natura naturans, hence there would only be essential power in its indistinguishable unity, but not in plurality. But because substance is both one and many, it is thus always, it always involves infinite intellect as its mode, not as a top-down mediation or not as a mediative agent, but as what is constituted itself in this manner of modal multiplicity, while at the same time being the infinite power of the natura naturans, the whole nature. It is the infinite intellect then which can grasp both the moment of indivisibility and the moment of plurality in their disjunction, because it is constituted in both ways, not because it mediates. And because of this, then it can hold them together and express it in the infinity of attributes. So infinite intellect is thus not at all a finite human consciousness or mind, and can in no way be equated with it. Instead, for Spinoza, we, as human modes, are finite parts of the infinite intellect of God, both with our minds and with our bodies. And these are the two attributes that we have access to for Spinoza: thought or ideas, and corporeal extension or bodies. This means that we can conceive of the substantial power of existence, of life, either in terms of ideas or in terms of bodies. This is why then these attributes, as thinking and corporeality, or bodies and ideas, are, as Chantal Jacquet argues, two different ways of grasping the same power. In other words, both thinking and bodily being are the ways or the manner of expressing the third common, the essential power of being. This is important for the crucial point that I want to argue against in Negri's reading of Spinoza, his equation of the plane of constitution, in other words, plane of power, with the plane of physical corporeality. I maintain that because Negri understands intellect as human mind or consciousness, he thus first equates the originary power and self-constitutive potentia with the physical materiality or corporeal mechanism that would then, through the human tendency towards the physical multitude, pass to a different ethical level through human intellect and consciousness. And I quote from Savage Anomaly: the physical or corporeal or mechanical power of being transitions to the ethical subjective dimension through human constitutive power, the subjective continuity of being. End of quote. I argue that it is this that becomes the basis for humanist and proto-teleological or tendentialist, directionalist reading of Spinoza. But as I just tried to show with a different interpretation of the infinite intellect and of the attributes, sorry, I lost it. This power of being or life is never merely corporeal or physical in Spinoza. As we have seen, corporeal extension or bodies are themselves just as much an attribute of nature, modes of extension, as ideas are modes of thought. Both are already constituted through the infinite intellect then, and thus none of them are directly the essential power itself. So the relationship between attributes is not a dualistic relationship where one would be dependent on the other, that thought or infinite intellect would develop from corporeal physicality. Instead, both thought and bodies express the third, the common power that is never, I quote, a purely mechanical horizon itself, that then becomes subjective with the passage from physicality to ethicality, as Negri writes, which is, for Negri again, achieved by human appropriative activity. Instead, this nature is always already intelligible and self-constituting for Spinoza, with or without human consciousness, because this intelligibility is the same as its own self-constitution through the infinite intellect. So there always was and is the subject in my reading, but this subject is not the finite individual human, a man in its appropriative power, which is, as Negri writes, something on which a perspective of constitution can organize itself. Instead, this subject is the infinite intellect, that is the infinite power expressed in natura naturata, that is the perspective of self-constitutive bottom-up organization of the whole of nature. This is why then I argue that the ontological plane, the plane of power, is instead always already what Cordella calls an epistemontological plane in Spinoza, which is not the same as the material production in its crude
physical or corporeal sense, but is the activity in its fullest sense of being, as the power of existence or life and its reproduction, which is always already epistemontological. This then leads me to the last point of my talk, to the humanist proto-teleology or tendentiality in Negri's reading of Spinoza. So, since the epistemontological self-constitutive power of the infinite nature does not need the humanist discovery, or what Negri calls humanist appropriation, in order to be this self-constitutive and subjective and that intelligible, since it is always already such, hence there is no necessary tendency in any particular finite mode to become more and more powerful through appropriation, or more and more active and more free in relation to externality. Even though all finite modes are striving to persevere against externality, there is no tendency that would ensure that they will, since they can never fully overcome their finitude. And it is only on the infinite nature as a whole that we can say that it is fully active and free without externality. But no finite can reach this infinity with expansion of the multitude or appropriation in the manner of kind of bad infinity in the sense. Hence, this process of self-constitution for the finite modes is always necessarily a plane of relatively passive external forces and external determinations by other finite modes, always a process of the multitude as well, and always a trans-individual process. But this in no way guarantees that there will be a tendency towards increase in the relative active, power or freedom for any specific finite mode. They might just as well stay passive and externally determined, and they always will to an extent, no matter how multitude they become. This passivity or experiencing life in a passive mode is just as much expressive of the same essential power, the same power or potentia of the multitude. And from the infinite totality of nature, it is no less perfect, as there is no directionality in nature that would be attributed to specific finite modes for them to become infinitely active in Spinoza. So everything depends, I quote from Spinoza, on the realities of humans as they exist in their specific degree of powerlessness. And this cannot be foreseen. What Negri calls the external barriers to freedom are therefore actually themselves the expressions of the weakness of the potentia of the finite multitude that is unable to organize itself better. But the radicality of Spinoza consists precisely in saying that nevertheless, this actual weakness is never fixed. In other words, the possibility of increasing the power can never be removed. So there can be no absolute subsumption, but this can happen not as a result of the appropriative activity, as man as a finite mode can never appropriate the good infinity, but it can happen based on the capacity or ability to arrive at the most common notion or idea of nature that is the same infinite and indivisible active power of life as that of finite mode itself. But this capacity, as we saw, has to do with the infinite intellect and us being parts of it, because it has to, both bodily and with thought, because it has to do with grasping both the moment of indivisibility and the moment of plurality and holding them together, or holding them in their disjunctive tension, to use Negri's words, between the infinite and the finite. This is then what enables us to grasp infinite activity of life as ours, in spite of our finitude and relative passivity. I'm really finishing. But this is never tendential then. There is no tendency to foresee whether it will happen or not. It will happen if there is enough power in a finite mode. It won't if there is not enough internal power, or if there is something more powerful that is against it externally. But precisely because there is no tendency, every mode or everyone is free to enact it in what Spinoza calls moments of clarity, as Spinoza says, when life is lived not as an external force, an effect of, to refer to Veronica's talk yesterday, an effect of surprise rather than a tendency. But this will always happen while some external potestas is still there, as it will always still be there for the finite modes. That is why, to refer to the quote, a free man thinks of nothing less than of death, and his wisdom, this is a quotation from Spinoza, and his wisdom is a meditation on life, not on death. In my reading, that would be precisely what Negri calls grounding oneself in the absolute, or the subjective rupture. So to conclude, what reading Negri non-humanistically means is, or what reading Spinoza non-humanistically means is that, yes, there is constitutive multitude, that is the finite world in itself, but that is the whole of nature, and thus it is not specifically true for humans and does not have a tendency towards human immanent freedom. What is descriptively, but not in any specific essence, human is relatively more explicit consciousness of the common intelligibility, the intelligibility which is still there in everything because of the infinite intellect of nature. But this relative more consciousness through relatively more common notions is not a guaranteed tendency, because even though we never know what a body can do, to quote Deleuze, we also never know what external affects might we suffer. So what is unavoidable, though, is that against the absolute subsumption perspective, there will always be a potentia or power for relatively more and more active freedom, and that is because of the active essence that is in all of us implicitly or explicitly, because of life that we can never fully experience as mechanistic, dead, or passive matter. So there will be, to say maybe to refer to it as slips of the tongue, so to say, there will be moments of clarity, even in passivity, that one can follow towards more activity. But whether this following will happen or not is unprojectable, as it is dependent on each case again and again, as it is the singular formative path. Thus, there is no tendency that is progressive, there is just the condition, the capacity that is unremovable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I invite public to ask questions, and we have like 20 minutes approximately for questions from the public. There's no need for. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Yes. Hi.
What do you make of the infinite immediate mode?
In relation to infinite. Okay. Yeah.
We'll
Sorry. Yeah.
Few more, and Michael.
Adrian and Sinem, both of you mentioned the current Turkish situation very briefly in passing, about the relation between capital and state and the fascist ideology, about this crossing the streets. Is there, there's some things about the current Turkish situation that could explain your theoretical points? Like would some aspects of the Turkish situation